Several weeks ago, I listened to participants in Interfaith Action of Southwest Michigan discuss the responsibilities for addressing U.S. policy with respect to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. As I was listening, I asked myself, in this multi-religious nation, are there distinctively religious contributions that we can make to this vital public debate? One possible answer arises from the striking importance of the migrant, the exile, the representations of religious identity in many of the major world religions. Flights from danger, journeys toward freedom, searches for a new home, return to a lost home are foundational myths in the world's religions. Myths that we collectively remember and repeat in our acts of worship and our ethical ideals. These mythical journeys of the migrant, the exile, and the refugee have profoundly shaped religious identities of individuals and communities through the millennia. And today I want to encourage each of us to think about what it means for personal religious life, to imagine it as journeys of this sort. Then I want to ask how thinking of yourself as a migrant in this world sets up a different relationship to those persons who have migrated into your community. How might sustained dialogue with them, your fellow migrants, teach you about your own religious identity and ethical priorities? How might elevating this theme, "We are all migrants," alter in concretely practical ways the worship services, social activism, and interfaith relations pursued by our own religious community? As I begin, keep in mind that across the centuries, religions have generated multiple metaphors of identity and meaning. They have important things to say, for example, about the ethics of welcoming and serving the stranger who comes from beyond the familiar landscapes of our community. But these two perspectives on religion and migration, "We are all migrants" and "Welcome the migrant," are complementary dimensions of a religious ethic, not mutually exclusive alternatives. So first, religion on the journey of life. The religions with which I'm familiar have narratives of migration, journey, flight, and exile at or very near the center of their identities. These stories not only have prominent places in the calendars of religious holidays, but also important ethical implications for how we live our lives. A potential advantage of entering the current discussion of immigration policy and attitudes toward recent migrants from this angle is that it does not begin with us and the other. Instead, it asks why so many religious perspectives on human life urge that all of us regard ourselves as migrants, pilgrims, and exiles. How do we learn about ourselves? What do we learn about ourselves when we reflect on our personal identities as strangers and pilgrims? The objective then would be to begin from a common religious affirmation about life. We're all migrants. and to deepen that affirmation through sustained dialogue with persons who are experiencing the concrete daily struggles out of which our religious narratives have been built. It is amazing to recognize how often stories of migration or exile drawn from the writings of religious traditions are present in the films, novels, or magazine articles that are part of daily life. Unless we listen carefully, we may fail to hear them reverberating throughout American culture. Several years ago, I was immersed in the last week of organizing a 2-day public conference to be held in downtown Chicago on the book of Genesis. As I looked across the table where I was working, 2 seemingly random items caught my attention. From the end of the 17th century, an early anti-slavery tract, Samuel Sewall's The Selling of Joseph. And from 1996, the college student playbill for a production of Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. These narratives of exile, journey, captivity are throughout our culture. From urges toward moral reform to Broadway musicals. So, throughout American culture, we see these stories used as metaphors to interpret what is going on in our contemporary situation and to help us decide what to do. For instance, a recent essay in the New Yorker magazine discusses responses to the coronavirus pandemic from inmates in an Arkansas prison. The author, Rachel Aviv, follows the experiences of one particular prisoner, DeMarco Rayner, who is part of a group of prisoners who call themselves the Think Tank, all of whom have been imprisoned for 15 years or longer and who have taken up the role of guiding younger inmates. In mid-March, when the coronavirus first arrived in Arkansas, the think tank discussed the story of Noah. One prisoner told Miss Aviv, "Here was a man building an ark, and he is saying, 'Get ready, prepare.'" But no one was listening. DeMarco Rayner found the story of Moses more relevant. I view it more like these are the plagues that God is sending upon Pharaoh, who is in love with his authority, in order to let his people go. I find 3 important themes underlying the words of DeMarco Rayner and his fellow prisoners. First, religious narratives of migration typically have a destination, and that goal is strongly communal. The Exodus tells of God's purpose, as DeMarco Rayner summarized it, to let his people go. However, the destination is also elusive, partially hidden, undefined. Consider, for instance, God's promise to Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that it will be a blessing." The biblical scholar James Kugel notes that this passage raises a series of questions that rabbis and historians have debated for centuries. Kugel writes, "If God was so pleased with Abraham, why did he begin by telling him to leave home? To leave one's homeland meant leaving the security of family and friends and becoming a defenseless wanderer. If God truly wished to bless Abraham, would he not at least have allowed him to stay where he was? When God first told Abraham to leave his homeland, it was to go to a land that I will show you. Why did God not say to the land of Canaan? This order sounded as if it were deliberately worded to test Abraham's faith, as if God were saying, follow me, I will not even tell you where we are going. In the 17th century, John Bunyan, in his famous allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress, captured this combination of a momentous journey toward an indistinct destination in an incident in which the pilgrim encounters a band of shepherds from whom he borrows a telescope. They tell him that he can use the telescope to see the promised land. But as he lifts it to his eye, the pilgrim's hands shake. He fails to focus, and he departs the shepherds with only a blurry notion of where he is headed. Some resonance of this tradition, refocused this time on national identity, may be found in Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address, when he speaks of the new nation's destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. Second, when we view our journey, our life journey, as migration, we have a lot to learn about the language, customs, and values of this new country we have entered. As religious migrants, we have some critical distance on society. Most importantly, this critical distance enables us to make some decisions about the society's customs and values. We're cautious about the uncritical assimilation of the conventional wisdom. Returning to that Arkansas penitentiary with which I began, DeMarco Rayner very carefully, it is noted in the article, monitors his use of language so that he doesn't assimilate to institutional life. He refuses to call food money. He does not invite people to his house when he means his cell. He bristles when prisoners working unpaid jobs describe an officer as their boss. In 1948, the social activist and founder of the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day, kept a journal for a year, which she entitled On Pilgrimage. Much of the journal described Dorothy Day's journeys to the houses of hospitality she had founded across the nation for persons in poverty, and to join picket lines to protest housing discrimination. But her journal begins with the 2 months she spent at her daughter Tamar's home, helping to prepare for the birth of Tamar's baby. At the end of March, it was time to say goodbye. Day writes, "So now tomorrow I start off again on pilgrimage, for we have no abiding city. Much as we may want to strike our roots in, we are doomed to disappointment and unhappiness unless we preserve our detachment. It is the paradox of the Christian life." Third, the migrant or exile thus possesses a certain freedom toward inherited, culturally assimilated ways of doing things, a freedom to reconstruct or reinvent traditional expectations. Once again, the migrations of Abraham provide a good illustration. Traditions in Mecca held that Abraham's younger son, Ishmael, was exiled from Palestine and journeyed to Mecca. Abraham traveled to meet Ishmael there, and together they followed the instruction of God to build a house, the Kaaba, on foundations that had originally been laid by Adam, the first human. In the year 605 of the Common Era, the citizens of Mecca decided to reconstruct, but over who would set in place the holy black stone. The young Muhammad arbitrated this dispute, and the black stone was set into the wall. But in the years immediately following, Muhammad received the revelations that would eventually become the Quran, and the citizens of Mecca expelled him from the city in the year 622. He migrated to what is now Medina, gathered followers, reoriented the direction of prayer away from Jerusalem and toward Mecca, and reconstructed old ideas of pilgrimage to Mecca, prayer, and service to the poor into the Muslim Hajj. Muhammad went on his first and final Hajj as a Muslim in the year of his death, 632. So what are the practical implications of these 3 points? Migration has a destination, however indistinct. Migration, the sense of being a pilgrim, provides critical distance from our surrounding society. And the sense of being a pilgrim, a migrant, a traveler, gives us the perspective to reinvent the conventional traditions of the world in which we live. The American Jesuit theologian John Courtney Murray wrote in the mid-20th century that disagreement is a hard thing to achieve. We need to reach agreement on certain things in order to engage in a real dialogue, learn from one another, and decide, for example, on matters of public policy. Otherwise, we aren't disagreeing, we're simply talking past each other. If we begin by agreeing that we are all migrants and that this is a good thing, indeed, the indispensable thing, we have much to learn from one another. Dialogue seeks new ideas because genuine dialogue is humble and does not pretend to have a clear knowledge of its destination. At the practical level, then, first, we need to build active collaboration among different faiths and congregations in order to reconstruct and reinvent the faith of migrants and pilgrims who are seeking to discover the land that God will show you. Second, at the same time, we need to elevate and reinterpret the rituals of migration and exile within our various religious communities. This needs to happen in our worship services, the educational programs for our children, and the readings we select for congregational book clubs. How, in today's world, for instance, should Christians think about and ritually enact the flight into Egypt of Mary, Joseph, and their infant? Third and finally, religious narratives such as the Exodus have long had an indisputable influence on our national narrative. who we are as the United States, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill? How may the religious affirmation, "we are all migrants," support a religious critique and reinvention of our national narrative? A story, as Jefferson put it, of destinies beyond the reach of mortal eye. Thank you.